Welcome to Washington Policy Center's Washington Policy on the Go. My name is David Bose. I'm the Communications and Marketing Director for Washington Policy Center. And this is where every other week we come to you outside of the legislative session to talk with our Senate directors about the latest in policy. Once in a rare while, we'll have a special guest on, but this is not one of those times. Although he is a special personality and a special talent for research. His name is Todd Myers. He is our new Vice President for Research, and he has been with Washington Policy Center a long time with a long track record of amazing work, and we are very pleased to have him on the program today. Todd, thanks as always for joining me. I know that you have an extra busy schedule, especially with your new duties, and but you've done some tremendous work. And it reminded me, actually, looking at the blog, every once in a while a blog will show up and I haven't seen it ahead of time. This last one you posted reminded me of showing up at the store at the end of summer and seeing Halloween decorations on, because you've got this horrifying zombie picture, AI picture, where the zombie represents the Results Washington. Let's talk about why Results Washington's a zombie and where it came from. Starting with the Seattle Times editorial board, you were there to talk about Initiative 2117 and talk about its merits. And tell us about the response of the Seattle Times editorial board, and what you expected and some of the challenging questions that you received.
Yeah. So let me give a little bit of background on what the heck Results Washington is. So as you said, I was with the Seattle Times editorial board. We were debating 2117. People can actually go to TVW and watch that whole debate. And see sort of the whole discussion about 2117, which would repeal the state's tax on CO2 emissions called the Climate Commitment Act. And so we were there to debate it before the editorial board. And one of the things that we pointed out was that as much as people talk about wanting to reduce CO2 emissions and how critical it is that we have government programs, Washington state government in particular, but government in general, doesn't even track whether it's doing that, the results. They simply, put the money out there, they spend the money, but they never go back to see if it worked. This is completely the opposite of what you see in the private sector. Microsoft, for instance, spends lots of money on projects that reduce CO2 emissions. And if those projects that they spent money on fail, Microsoft actually gets the money back. They demand results or they don't pay. And the state doesn't do that. The state actually pays and then doesn't worry about whether they track. And the thing is that Joe Fitzgibbon, who's the Democratic leader in the House, actually admitted that they don't track. So one of the other ways to track is a program called Results Washington, which I've been looking at and critiquing for years, that the governor has to show, okay, here's our results on various different policy areas. And the purpose was to publicly show how we're doing, where we're succeeding, where we're failing, so that there's accountability. But it has a fun history, because it never really did that. And in fact, in 2019, when the governor ran for president, they actually shut down the Results Washington page because the numbers were so bad, particularly in the area of climate. So I pointed this out, that Results Washington doesn't really have anything there. And so they asked the governor's office, and Mike Falk, the governor's spokesperson, said, oh, no. Results Washington, and the phrase was alive and well. Well, that's just ridiculous. There are 3 pieces of data about climate in Washington state. One is from 2022, one is from 2020, and one is from 2019. We're almost at the end of 2024, and the most recent data they have is 2 years old, and one is almost 5 years old. So I figured, that I would create an image that said, instead of being alive and well, Results Washington is a zombie, which it is, because it's The Walking Dead. They have stuff there, but it's not new, it's not useful, it doesn't do anything like what it was supposed to.
Coincidentally, I did host the Emerald City Comic-Con convention cast of The Walking Dead. So this fits with me really well. One of the things you brought up was, Results Washington, this idea that they're tracking these results and that results are a priority. And you point out that, our state government pays whether results happen or not. But another thing you pointed out recently, I can't remember if we did it on the go or if it was just in your blog, but the grants that the state was passing out based on the Climate Commitment Act were also they were not tracking results. The results weren't the thing that gave you the extra points to win the grant. It was other kinds of considerations, ideological considerations, things like that. But actual success in achieving benefits for the environment did not give you extra points.
Right. So I'll give you two examples. One that you will hear about 2117, and if we repeal the CO2 tax, they say it will be bad for clean air. And when you ask, okay, what are you spending on clean air? What they're spending it on is air quality monitoring, not air quality improvements, air quality monitoring. Well, okay, that's fine, but every projection shows that we have clean air as it is. We don't violate any of the clean air quality standards. And furthermore, air quality is going to get better and is going to continue to get better by all projections. So why would you spend millions and millions of dollars on air quality monitoring and not on things that actually help? But the second thing to your point is that there are grants, right? The Department of Commerce and others are spending the tax money, the more than $2 billion in new tax money that they've raised on projects that they say will help fight climate change. And one of them is actually called the Community Decarbonization Program. But if you look at the grant requirements, so anytime they put out a grant, right, you apply, there's a bunch of different points. They tell you, okay, if you do this, you get this many points, you do this many points, and then they rank them based on points. Well, you get points, for instance, 5 guaranteed points, if your contract, and I think if I remember it correctly, it's basically, it doesn't do arbitration. There's some union-friendly thing that they want in there, and you get 5 guaranteed points. Okay, that's fine. But if it's the decarbonization grant, how many guaranteed points do you get for decarbonization? And the answer is 0. It is one consideration in a group of only 20 points out of 90. You could literally do nothing for decarbonization and still get a huge amount of points. And so there's a Q&A that the Department of Commerce has on this. They say, well, somebody asked, will you be comparing based on decarbonization? And they say, no, we will not be prioritizing based on the amount of carbon reductions. We will be comparing based on carbon reductions within project type. And then they go on to say, but the Department of Commerce reserves the right to do what is in the best interests of the Department of Commerce. And so even in a grant called Community Decarbonization, they openly say that decarbonization is not a priority. So, people are going to hear all sorts of things about, oh, we need this to recover salmon. We need this to fight climate change. But when you look at a lot of these expenditures, they don't actually do the thing that they are promised. Now, this is not to say that all of the money is wasted, right? There are some, I have been arguing for a long time that we need to invest more in salmon recovery because there's a lot of work to be done. But I also argue that we ought to demand results and that we ought to get bureaucracy out of the way to make every dollar go farther. But that's not the mindset, unfortunately, of too many people, which is just put as much money out there, claim we're saving salmon, take the political credit and move on. And that's not going to help us achieve our environmental goals.
I was just thinking if salmon recovery were treated the same as the CCA treats the carbon emissions, then you could have all kinds of grants going out that don't save any salmon, and they would have priority over one that, say, increase the stream over 5 years salmon by 40%, because they're not comparing the results and they don't care. It's an obviously destructive and inefficient and ridiculous way to manage environmental policy. And what's amazing is people giving themselves or politicians giving themselves credit for being environmental, yet being so uncaring about maximizing resources for the actual benefit of the objectives they claim to want to reach.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things on that. First is that when I was on the Puget Sound Salmon Recovery Council, in the final year that I was there, there's a law called the HEAL Act, which is about environmental justice, and says that we have to put a certain amount of our environmental money to promote environmental justice. The explicit purpose of that law is to take away money from scientifically allocated projects and steer it toward certain politically favored communities. In the case of salmon recovery, the way that would work is that you would take money from projects that were scientifically ranked very high by scientific metrics, but were in areas that were rural, like Fall City and things like that. In fact, one year Fall City had a project that was #1, but Fall City is not going to rank highly on an environmental justice scale. Where does rank environmentally high on an environmental justice scale? Well, downtown Seattle. Well, you can spend an enormous amount of money in downtown Seattle and make basically no impact on salmon because there's so much damage there. And yet that's what the HEAL Act was telling us to do, is to say, stop focusing entirely on science and add these political considerations. And that became really dramatically clear when the not the Salmon Recovery Council, but the Puget Sound Partnership offered a change to the grant program that would allow 10% free points to any project that was proposed by a traditionally disadvantaged community. Openly saying that simply because somebody was from the right community, that should reduce the value of science and increase the value of politics. Now, I objected to that, and fortunately, so did the tribes. Because the tribes know we're not succeeding in salmon recovery, and we can't play political games when we're failing. Political games are only going to make it worse, not better. And so, to their credit, they stood up for me, and that proposal was shot down. But those are the sort of influences that we see. And I will just add one thing. There are some really amazing things that are going on to help make sure that we get the most bang for the buck. Yesterday, I talked with somebody I've known for a while. She works in conservation technology, and she started a new group called Wildbond, and she uses artificial intelligence to create tools so that people around the world can identify where the best habitat is for species, where there's species biodiversity. The AI listens and can identify what species are where. So, and what she said is that they're working in Indonesia because the Indonesian government only has a limited amount of money, and they can say, look, if you're going to put some money to protect habitat, here's where to put it, rather than over here where it may not make much difference. That's incredible. That's the kind of stuff that we need to do to make a big difference. And it, uses money wisely. It's good for the environment, and it takes the politics out of it and puts data at the front.
Now, the Seattle Times came out and supported keeping the Climate Commitment Act, but it also followed that up with a fact check on a number of things that, it was kind of, it struck me as amusing because they're the kinds of points that you've been making from the beginning, and that one would think would cause great concern over that policy. Why don't you run us through what some of those things were and why you were pleased that the Seattle Times recognized those items?
Well, I knew that the Seattle Times was not going to say vote yes on 2117 to repeal the CO2 tax. Just that's not where the members of this editorial board are. One of the members, editorial board members that he and I got into a couple of back and forths on is Dow Constantine's former press secretary. So he is not gonna, say, no, we need to repeal the CO2 tax, right? He's all the way committed. But I was very pleased that they did a fact check. Given the fact that they supported repeal, they were not going to go out of their way to, be nice to me and favorably fact check the things I'm saying. I am certain that they looked at things that I said and were trying to fact check them to find things that I'd said were wrong. But I encourage people to go read it. They're a little generous, I think, to the no side. But fundamentally, what they found was a few things. First, they're very clear that the CO2 tax increased gas prices. They have a chart that shows that it increased gas prices by about 40 cents a gallon at one point, and it's currently about 23 cents a gallon. That is almost exactly what we have said and what we predicted before. So I'm very pleased that they did that. They also pointed out that one of the claims is that the if we get rid of the CO2 tax, that it will harm funding for roads and bridges. It's completely false. In fact, the law specifically says that the tax money can't be used for roads and bridges. And the only argument from Joe Fitzgibbon, who was one of the authors of the Climate Commitment Act, was, well, but if we don't have this money, then we'll have to steal from roads and bridges and give it to the things that we want, like electric ferries. Well, there's no reason they need to do that. They might as well say, well, it would harm mental health because we'll steal from mental health funding to fund electric ferries or something like that, right? I mean, they can sort of make up anything they want, but it's their choice. It is not a result of taking the tax money away. And the argument that, well, yes, we have $2 billion more now than we did in 2022, but we have to retroactively punish those because we only have $2 billion more, makes no sense. And the Seattle Times recognized that. They did ask, okay, so like, where's the accountability on transparency and you know, how are we achieving our goals with these funding? And Joe Fitzgibbon said, well, yeah, there's no list, there's no accountability, there's no actual list of are these things working, but the accountability is at the ballot box. Okay, I think that's fine, but nobody votes. Very few people, I should say, vote for one party or other on one narrow issue about whether this program, you know, achieved its goals. But even if they did, they're not releasing the data. So even if people wanted to make that decision and hold them accountable, the state is refusing to release the data that would allow them to. And I think that just shows you what a disingenuous argument that is.
Yeah, and I was going to add too that you can't say there's accountability at the ballot box when you're hiding and obscuring the information. I mean, we've seen the governor said that there was not going to be any impact on costs from the Climate Commitment Act, and you uncovered his report from 2014, his own report showing that there would be a massive increase in the cost of fuel. It was, you know, you used the same calculations that California used, where they openly talk about the impact on fuel prices. They debate it openly. They tell people what it's going to cost, and then they decide whether or not they want to do it or not. It's Washington State that takes the approach of, we're going to tell people that it's going to be pennies or nothing. And then when costs do go up, we're going to blame the greed of oil companies and other people and pretend like it doesn't exist. And that's not, you know, being so wildly dishonest with the with what's really going on doesn't have that honest debate where people could, you know, hold something accountable at the ballot box when it's obscured like that. So
yeah,
good point.
and now their argument is, well, nobody can know, right? Nobody can know how much actually it does. Well, literally everybody else, as you point out, the Inslee administration at one time said, we know, here's the calculation. And they used the same calculation that I did, same calculation that California did. So at one point, they too said, we know. But now, when the numbers look bad, when it's turned, you know, politically unfavorable, now they're like, well, we can't really tell what's happening. The notion that you don't know when you raise taxes, the impact on prices is obtuse at best.
Well, it's interesting to bring up because we were talking earlier about an interview you did for public radio recently where they brought up the idea that it was unknowable to know what the tax impact on price would be. It was just like, you know, that's like trying to figure out what's in a universe light years away. It's just unknowable, like a theological question. You know, this idea that if you tax something at X rate, you're not sure what impact that will have on the prices. I'm not sure where this came from. This is a new argument to me that I have not encountered in my time here in policy life over many decades. This idea that if you add to costs from people, you can't figure out how much it's going to add to prices.
Well, yes, we added an 8 cent per plastic bag price, But who knows what that actually increases cost, right? I mean, it's
Yeah.
very clear. Like, we don't have sales tax on food. Why? Because we know it raises prices of food. This notion that, it's unclear is ridiculous. The only reason that they're saying this is because they know the number is bad and they don't want to admit it. But people who say those sorts of things, you should remember them. You should remember, that the chair, Rachel Smith of the Seattle Chamber of Commerce, says, well, if we cut the tax, there's no guarantee prices will go down. That's absurd. Of course, prices are going to go down. The Seattle Chamber of Commerce itself argues for reductions in taxes. They don't, then say, oh, well, you can reduce taxes, but we may not do anything or it may not impact us. No, they know it's dishonest. And so, like, I offered to bet Rachel Smith, the head of the Seattle Chamber of Commerce. I said, all right, let's say I-2117 passes. I will bet you the prices go down. She's ignored me. Why? Because she knows I'm right. There's no right. Why would she bet when she knows that she's playing a game and is wrong and will be shown to? So better to just, sort of duck. But when people say absurd things, you should remember it's like, oh, okay, I know who you are. You're willing to say things that are absurd because you hope that it will help in the short term your side. And I just think that that is so corrosive of good public policy discussions.
Isn't it fair to say too that the carbon market created by the CCA is almost a futures market to a certain extent, where right now the prices are lower because there's an expectation that it might be gone and they won't have to purchase any anyway. So the price goes way down, and that alone tells you that there's a big impact on price because fuel prices went down accordingly. And then if the repeal does not pass and the law stays put, then the nature of the reduced number of credits out there means the prices will go up because people will have to use fuels and use the things that they need to do.
That's exactly right. And so, as you said, we have seen, like, all the projections from the Department of Ecology and everybody else were that under normal circumstances, prices would have gone up this year because the number of allowances, the number of available permits essentially to emit CO2 would go down this year. So you drop supply, and then prices typically go up. And that was, like I said, Department of Ecology's own projections. They went down this year almost by more than half, depending on the baseline. And the reason is that the companies that buy permits this year have to turn them in next year. Well, if the program is repealed, they don't have to, right? They've paid for something this year that doesn't exist next year, so they don't want to. So they're hedging. So you're right. There is a bit of a futures market. But getting back to the question of whether this impacts prices and how it impacts prices, BP, right? Rachel Smith, the Seattle Chamber of Commerce, said, look, BP supports this, right? And so they constantly talk about BP supporting this. Well, we know that reduction in price reduces the tax because I have the invoices. Last year, when the price was $50-something a metric ton, they were passing that straight through on their invoices, and I have that invoice. Now that the price has gone down, guess what? I have their invoice. The price has gone down on their invoice. So we know that when the price changes, whether that's being cut in half or cut to zero, that BP and everyone else are going to change their prices. It would make no sense in a competitive market for you to keep essentially collecting a tax that didn't exist when your competitors were saying, oh, well, no, we're not going to charge you the 23 cents a gallon that BP is. Come to us. It's absolutely absurd. And we have the evidence. I mean, it's just common sense. But I guess, unfortunately, in campaigns, common sense doesn't always rule the day.
Well, amen to that, and it's a frustrating thing to see, but that's the nature of what we work in. You just gotta keep pushing through, keep going, and keep knocking loud enough, and eventually people will wake up. And I think that's one of the key aspects here. We've got our annual dinner for Eastern Washington coming up next Friday with guest Dennis Prager, plus Dr. Robert Marbut. He is a senior fellow at the Discovery Institute Center for Wealth and Poverty and a former federal homelessness czar. Basically, he headed federal homelessness efforts. He's the nation's top expert on the causes of homelessness. We had him on Washington Policy on the Go a week ago, so it was just a fascinating conversation. I'd encourage people to go to our YouTube channel if you haven't yet and see what he had to say and what he's offering, because he'll be on a Solutions on Homelessness panel at our Eastern Washington annual dinner next week in Spokane. You can get tickets at WPCdinner.com. That's WPCdinner.com. Todd, I also wanted to give you one shameless plug on your fantastic interview with John Stossel. The YouTube hits on that are what I think they're just about to tip 400,000 hits, making it one of the more popular Stossel videos of the last year. And you just did a tremendous job outlining the realities of some of Washington's pressing issues, like the Lower Snake River dams, and how there are those who are advocating the removal of the dams are ignoring the evidence in favor of keeping the dams, regardless of how much money and how much and how little environmental benefit there might be. They just keep pressing forward, and Stossel did a great job, and you provided the facts for him. Really fantastic. People can watch that at WashingtonPolicy.org. Go to our latest section, and we have it embedded there in the blog. You can see it all there. Todd, anything about that? I mean, I know you're going to do a follow-up on that, because you said a lot was left on the cutting room floor. Anything that jumped to your mind there as far as what you wish had still been in the video, or wish there was a follow-up video in that way?
Yeah, anytime you try to boil the Snake River dams or anything else down to a 6-minute video, there's going to be a lot that's left behind, especially for policy wonks like me. I am going to point out some things that I think need elaboration, and one of them is they asked, okay, so like, what are the alternatives? How can you do? What else can we do other than tear down the Snake River dams that would help? And so I mentioned seals and sea lions. The Washington Academy of Sciences has a good report out a couple years ago saying that seals and sea lions at both the mouth of the Columbia and on the Puget Sound are preventing, or I should say hindering, salmon recovery in those areas. So changing the laws about those populations, I think, would make a difference. But, that's not the only thing. There are things we need to do on habitat, on reducing the amount of brake dust and tire rubber and things like that go in that have a detrimental effect on salmon. So there's lots of things that we can do. And basically, my argument is it's going to cost us, $35 billion or more to destroy the dams and replace the electricity and other things like that from those dams. What else could we do with $35 billion? We could do a tremendous amount of things that would be helpful. So I'll talk a little bit about that. I put out a paper last year saying that we need to get rid of this sort of silver bullet thinking that if we just do this, if we just tear down the dams, or we just do something else, that salmon will recover. And that's simply not the case. We have to do lots of things. It took us a long time to get to the point where salmon are at the populations there are now. It's going to take us a long time to get them back, but we need to make that incremental process and not, pretend that by blowing up dams, everything will be fine.
I want to take one audience question before we let you go, Todd. And this was, I guess it's almost a philosophical question, which is, why can't elected officials just be honest about prices going up and make the case? Why can't they just have the open debate about making prices higher for a specific benefit? Why do you think that is?
I think a couple of things. One, I think that they know that some people want to believe the fantasy that raising taxes doesn't raise prices, or they want to believe that, it's actually not their fault. It's the greedy corporations or any, things like that. They know that there is a market for that kind of nonsense, right? There is no reason the head of the Seattle Chamber of Commerce should be repeating silly arguments like that, and yet she is. So I think first is, why? Because they can get away with it. The second thing is that in the case of climate policy, we've been through this twice. In 2016, there was a revenue neutral carbon tax, actually, that would raise taxes on CO2 emissions and cut taxes on some business, but mostly sales taxes. And people voted against that. And then in 2018, the governor proposed an initiative very similar to what we have. And people talked about the prices. And guess what? That failed. So the message, what they learned from those two experiences is that people don't want to pay higher gas and energy prices. So they said, well, since people don't want to pay, we'll have to sell this to them and tell them that they don't have to pay. We'll just be dishonest. And that's, I think, and that's why, right, in 2014, they were honest. Even in 2019, they were honest about, the governor's office was honest about the increase in prices. But subsequent to that, they changed their mind and suddenly went, nope, it's going to have no impact whatsoever. And I think that they feel that the political lesson they learned is that honesty doesn't work and doesn't get them what they want.
It's funny that the result of the revenue neutral approach was no, and I think a large part of that is people do not trust the idea that electeds will be revenue neutral. I mean,
correct.
It's one of those things where you see the behavior and you understand why people say, no, don't trust you, not doing it, you know?
Yeah. Well, and the other thing, ironically, is that Governor Inslee and the environmental community opposed that. And what I think is so funny is that we often hear this thing about, oh, we can't wait. We must fight climate change. It is a crisis. But in 2016, they said, well, if we don't get increased taxes, we can wait. And the taxes were more important than doing something at that moment, they felt at that moment, to fight climate change. And so all the time, and we're going to hear it again, we're hearing it again already with 2117, we have to do this now. We can't wait any longer. We can't delay any longer. And it's like, coming from people who said it's okay to delay if we don't get any tax money, you know, it's not very persuasive to me.
That's just amazing. I mean, I had forgotten about that, and I think that's a great point about, you know, when they say we can't wait, then it's, well, for a couple $1 billion, it was worth the wait. I mean, that one that's worth it. The planet, you know, too bad for it, but to the $2 billion, we can really roll with that. That's a fantastic point. Todd, as always, just fascinating insights and great work, and looking forward to more on the blog at washingtonpolicy.org, and seeing you at our annual dinner event in Spokane next Friday at wpcdinner.com. For those of you who want to join us, and you should find some friends and get them involved as well. Bring them out. It's going to be a great evening with a really fascinating conversation with Dennis Prager and Dr. Robert Marbut and William Baldwin, the left-leaning actor who has found common cause with Dr. Marbut and when it comes to homelessness and desire to alleviate the problems there. So really looking forward to a night of information and engagement there. And I hope you will join us at wpcdinner.com. Join us in Spokane for our dinner next Friday. Todd, thanks so much for being with us today. And thank all of you for coming on and viewing this, and reminding you that it will also be on our YouTube channel. So if you enjoyed the conversation, share it with a friend, and then join us in 2 weeks. Thanks so much. Have a great day, everybody.